thank you very much. Hey, I love the way you just threw that out there. This is the fifth lecture of a 10-part series, which means we're halfway done. That's very impressive, Merle. You could be an economist in your next career. I went to university for 10 years and got a PhD so that I could make instantaneous calculations like 5 is halfway to 10, and you just did it. So awesome. I'm very impressed. But seriously, Merle, thank you to you and to the whole team at Later Life Learning. It's just a pleasure to work with your whole group. They're so on top of the logistics and the planning and the music. I love this music that they play at the beginning with an economic theme, but it's also danceable. You know, it gets you up and dancing, get the blood flowing. I'm in Vancouver, so it's still morning time here. So a little bit of, adrenaline flowing is good. And you can only see me on Zoom from the waist up. You don't see that I've got my leg warmers on and my other 1980s aerobic gear from the waist down. So that was going on there. I'm not going to show you. Don't worry. Anyways, it's a pleasure to work with your team. And I also want to emphasize that next week is Giving Week for the whole program. And please, everyone, spare a little mind space and hopefully a little bit of donation space to support next week the great work that they do. Okay, well, let's get on with today's activities, today's material. I'm just going to quickly put up the slides here. And hopefully that's looking okay. Merle, if you don't see this nice picture of people with masks in a lineup, give me a shout out. Otherwise, I'll assume that folks can see this. Just a couple of preliminaries before we get into the topic, the core topic for today, which is government and its role in the economy, a great topic. I just want to share a couple of things. We've been talking about labor and labor markets the last couple of weeks. And I want to just refer you to this column that I had. I have a monthly column in the Toronto Star in the business section on economics. And my column came out last weekend. And it was kind of, I think, relevant to what we've been talking about recently. The point of my column was to compare the employment recovery so far after COVID. We're not done COVID yet, but we're hopefully getting towards the end of this pandemic. We'll see. Compare our progress in rebuilding employment to what's happened south of the border. It's a very interesting comparison. Naturally, we're always comparing ourselves against the Americans, and we're often told that we're, somehow lagging them, and we should emulate their policies, of lower taxes and freer markets and more private activity, et cetera, et cetera. The point of my column, I'll pass the link around. You can find it just on the star.com website, but I'll put the link in the chat. The specific link in a minute, was that there's a really interesting comparison between Canada and the U.S. that's evolving on the employment recovery. This shows the level of employment in the two countries relative to the starting point when COVID hit. So we're setting this as an index where February 2020, the last full month before the lockdowns, is set at 100, and then we see what happened after that. And you see both countries had a catastrophic decline. I know we're going to have a discussion about COVID and the economy later in the course, but catastrophic decline, over 15% of employment lost in 2 months. And that wasn't the whole story, because there were a lot of people who were still employed but not working, staying at home. And then we started to recover and sort of claw our way back. It wasn't an instantaneous recovery. We're still, after a year and a half, last month's data, which was released about 10 days ago by Statistics Canada, shows that we finally got back to the level of employment we were at in February 2020. So it's not quite a full recovery because people aren't working enough hours, and we've had a population increase since then. So the job is not done yet, but we've got back to where we were, whereas the U.S. is still 5 million jobs below. And I just thought this is a very interesting moment to compare the two countries and how we do things differently. And think about this idea that, we in Canada are too soft, and we coddle our people too much, and we pay too high taxes, and that somehow hurts our economy. In fact, it seems to help our economy. We've got all our jobs back. We've also got all our participation back, unlike the United States. I actually think this is a bigger problem. The U.S. has had a problem of declining labor force participation for years, even before COVID, and now it's down 2 percentage points more during COVID. And this is people, in essence, working age people who've kind of given up. We talked about the participation rate 2 sessions ago. And strong participation means you're working or you're actively seeking work. You're in the market, if you like. And that decline in the U.S. is a big problem. The quality of the jobs in Canada is better as well. Higher wages, more full-time work. The public sector job creation in Canada, which again, some people say our government is too big, government's in the way. In fact, all the jobs in healthcare and education and other public services have really helped. And the thing that's why this is relevant, I think it casts some real doubt on arguments that you've probably heard, that our income support programs during COVID, remember we had a thing called CERB, Canada Emergency Recovery Benefit or something like that, CERB, that was in place for the first year. That was taken away a year ago. Then we've had another thing called the CRB and a bunch of other acronyms. And the argument has been made that people are sitting at home collecting CERB instead of out working. And the hard numbers that's absolutely false. There are more people working today than before COVID, and labor force participation is fully recovered. Unlike the US, where they canceled all those benefits months ago, and participation is still down. So my takeaway that I said in the column, the economy is composed of human beings. I think you've heard that once or twice so far in this course. Taking care of human beings is the best way to protect the economy. This kind of false dichotomy between health and the economy that we heard from some politicians during the pandemic, absolutely wrong. On the subject of the emergency income supports, if any of you were watching CBC News last night, the National, there was your friendly economics teacher on there commenting on the decision announced yesterday by Finance Minister Freeland to indeed cancel the remaining programs. The CRB and some other emergency measures are today is the very last day that they're in effect. And she did announce the replacement of those with some other alternatives that are supposedly more targeted on the retail and hospitality sectors and certain businesses that are very hard hit. But the reality is there's 800,000 Canadians who are still getting income through the CRB and its related programs. And my argument that I made yesterday was this is too soon. I also do some work in Australia, as you know, and in Australia they went tough love several months ago and cut off all the programs entirely. Then, lo and behold, they went back into a recession and they had another whole wave of pandemic. So anyways, that's just a little bit of tidbits of the news and what's happening and why the stuff that we talk about in this class is way germane to the world as it unfolds around us. So real-time debates. Okay, I'm going to do one other thing before we jump into today's thing. I'm going to just take 2 minutes and just cover a little bit of the material that we didn't get to last week, where we were discussing companies, who owns them, how they profit, how we measure profit, and how people get the profit. And there's just a couple bits that I really want to make sure we have out there for future courses, and also because there was a couple questions about it in the Q&A that we didn't get to. So I do want to just very quickly reference this. This is risky, of course, because if I take time today to cover what we didn't cover last week, then we won't finish what we're supposed to cover today, and I'll have to take time next week to cover what we were going to cover this week, and so on and so forth. But I'm going to try and do it. Remember, we described profit as a surplus, and that's true in an economic sense, that the economy is producing more than it needs just to feed everyone, clothe them, shelter them, and start production again the next year. And it's also true in an accounting sense. For a company, profit is calculated as what's left over after the company pays out all its costs. And the point I want to get to was the different ways that the owners of companies actually manage to get their hands on that profit. And this again ties back to this issue of the separation between ownership of individuals and the company as its own personality. Remember, we talked about the corporation having its own status in law. How do the individuals who own shares in the company get the profits of that company? We've talked about how the owners control the company very effectively by making sure that the CEO and other top directors are also owners, and a whole corporate governance structure that forces those directors to manage the companies in the interest of maximizing the profits and wealth of their owners. Then how do they actually get their hands on the cash? That's the issue. Lots of different channels. If you're in a very small business, a proprietorship, even a partnership, you sometimes just get the direct income from it. It depends whether you've incorporated the business or not. If it is a corporate and separate from you as an individual. Then you can pay it out in dividends to the owners, which is a major way. You can pay out interest. You can. There's all kinds of different forms of corporate finance where people have technically lent the money to the company that they own, preferred shares and that kind of thing, where they get things that are like interest payments. Or you can get capital gains. Capital gain is where the bit of the company you own becomes more valuable down the road because the company was more profitable, or because it was very attractive on stock markets and other investors bid up the shares. Those are all ways that the individuals who own companies, and remember, the top 2% of Canadians own the majority, the controlling stake in business wealth. The 2% get their hands on it through those different avenues. And the point that I wanted to leave, and it's actually relevant for today, our tax system has a very, very skewed approach to giving favors and rewards to people who get their income that way through the ownership of capital, compared to the rest of us who get our income by dragging our butts out of bed on Monday morning and doing a job. And it's important to keep track of this. There's all kinds of gobbledygook in economic theory about why investors do something special. It comes back to that argument that we've argued was false, that capital itself is productive and that owning capital is a productive act. We've shown that that isn't true. Capital itself is not productive. Human beings are productive, including by our knowledge and ability to wield tools in the course of our work. And owning capital is a social relationship, not an economic act. So in all those regards, the favors in our tax system, which tax capital income at a very favorable rate, are quite unfair. I've put it this way, that if you flip burgers for a living in a grease-covered fast food kitchen, you have to declare all of your income on your tax return. If you flip stocks and bonds for a living and you live off of dividends or capital gains or some of the other forms of capital income, the tax system doesn't require you to list everything. Capital gains is the best example. We have something called a partial inclusion rate. It's 50%. Which means you calculate how much you made on capital gains as an owner, and you only have to declare half of it. What a trick. A similar thing, different mechanism for dividend income and lots of other capital income. So it's interesting that despite the concentrated ownership of capital and the very unfair distributional effects of that, we've got these incredibly expensive tax preferences that benefit people even further. So it's also a way to figure out how concentrated wealth is. The top 2% of taxpayers, you can actually go and get this data from Revenue Canada, the top 2% of taxpayers get about 2/3 of all the capital gains exemptions, which shows that, again, what a large share of business wealth ownership they have. Finally, I did want to leave with the point that despite the favors that we've done to private business and the people who own them through the whole set of neoliberal policies that we've talked about. Oh, wait a minute, this is the wrong slide here. Excuse me on this one. I'm just going to skip this. Okay, here we are. Despite all of the favors that we've done to business and the owners of business, the actual economic effort of business has kind of slowed down during the neoliberal era. And we talk about this in the economics book on investment, business investment, and show that despite the rise in profitability that has occurred under neoliberalism because of greater access to markets, less government regulation, lower company taxes, and lower labor costs, companies are not pumping that money back in the form of investment. So this is straight out of the textbook, page 156. This shows the decline in the share of GDP that is invested in the advanced capitalist countries in new machinery and equipment. And this is net fixed capital investment, which means after we've covered wear and tear and the wearing out of old machinery, down from 12% before neoliberalism. So that was quick growth and fast pumping back of profits into the economy, to 4% by the 2012s. And I tell you, hasn't been updated, but I can tell you it's fallen by half again to something like 2% after COVID. And the same is true in Canada. This is some data that we've gathered through our center on the petering out of business investment in Canada, despite major efforts like big corporate tax cuts that were implemented in 2001 federally and provincially, elsewhere, and lots of other ways to promote business investment over this period, it has actually been declining as well, which suggests the whole idea of an economy that has to be led by private profit-seeking investment by private businesses might be running into some problems. Unlike the olden days in the history of capitalism, when business was ambitious and greedy and pumped some money back in, it seems these days that the owners of business are happy to sit back and collect their interest and dividends and capital gains and not actually have to do a lot of work for it. I often use the analogy. You often hear that, as we talked about, our welfare programs are too generous, and Canadians have lost the will to work. And I wonder if the easy profits that businesses are making in Canada have undermined the will for them to work. Maybe they've become locked into an unfortunate cycle of dependence. Okay, I don't want to blame them as individuals, but the reality is they're not doing the job that we need them to do. And therefore, what does that mean for our economic policy? We've got all kinds of financial activity and trading of stocks and bonds and lots of ways to suck money out of the stock market on a net basis. More money comes out of the stock market through dividends, share buybacks, mergers, than goes into the stock market in the form of new IPOs and investments in growing companies. So this is where I think we'll discuss this as we go along. I think we need to supplement private profit-seeking business with other ways of stimulating economic activity. Okay, that was a couple of minutes to sort of finish off a couple of key points from last week. Now we'll have a race against time to see if we can finish off all the key points for this week. Lesson 5, Government and the Economy. We'll be drawing on chapters 20 and 21 of the textbook. The key topics we're going to cover, the history. You remember, I always love to go to history. I always find it an inherently subversive lens to apply, and that's true in this topic as well. The historic role of government in capitalism, the economic functions of government today. We have described the class structure of society and the different ways that different groups of people relate to the economy and the different power positions they have. And that is relevant to the question of government as well, in terms of whose interests are promoted by government. We'll talk about the different policy levers and instruments that government has to influence the economy, the types and effects of government spending and government taxing. And then we'll conclude with some discussion about debts and deficits and balanced budgets and how much we have to worry about that kind of problem. And there's a list of the whole range of different terms. Remember, these are all defined in the online glossary that goes with the Economics for Everyone that I promised last week. I just remembered I would post on that site where we have all of our course outlines, and I haven't done that yet. So I've just made another note to myself. But at any rate, you can get it from the Economics for Everyone website, the glossary, where there's a short definition of all those terms. I want to kind of challenge a certain myth that we hear, kind of an urban myth or a bit of common sense wisdom, that capitalism as a system works best when government gets out of the way. And this idea that, once upon a time there was a true free market version of capitalism, where the inherent desire of humans to truck and trade, as Adam Smith famously put it, was unfettered, and people went at it through the free market. And then along came government with taxes and regulations and red tape and unions and all kinds of other things that screwed up that magical free market arrangement. So go back to the early Industrial Revolution. The reality is that there never was an unfettered free market system where government was out of the way. There never was. It never existed. In fact, if it were not for government, capitalism never would have been invented, and it certainly wouldn't have survived. And the reality is that government has played a critical role supporting, maintaining, enforcing, and stabilizing, and oftentimes saving capitalism from itself from the very beginning of it all. Without a strong government, capitalism would not exist. So the debate, there are certain kind of free market ideologues, maybe from the Fraser Institute or certain political forces who say government and capitalism are opposites on the spectrum, and we need more capitalism and less government. Absolutely historically false. Capitalism and government have worked hand in hand from the beginning, and helping to understand that history, I think, puts some needed perspective on all the debates about government policy, and the economy that we have today. One of my favorite economists is a guy named Dean Baker in the United States. He and I did a lot of work together. He's a wonderful, wonderful guy. Very has a great way of putting things. He challenges this idea of the so-called nanny state. This idea that government coddles people, and that screws up the operation of the free market. And what we need is, get government out of the way and let the market and the business sector do what they do best. So there's Nanny McPhee as our nanny for the nanny state. And this idea, Dean says, that conservatives trust the market and progressives want government is a myth. Conservatives want government too. They're just not honest about the ways in which they want the government to intervene, to distribute income upward. And he goes through a whole list of different ways that the government sticks its nose right into the economy, micromanages the economy in ways that help to strengthen property rights, the power position, the profits of businesses and the 2% who own the majority of businesses. I think that's a very fitting analogy. Let's go back a bit in the early years where capitalism first came about. In the late 18th, early 19th century, the former feudal regime was phasing out. And we remember our historical review of different economic systems. That regime, based on the inherited power and wealth of the landed gentry, who collected a surplus in kind of old-fashioned ways. They went around to the workers every year and just took it. That was being replaced by a system that still had a surplus and still had people who lived off that surplus, but it was arranged and collected in a different way. And the role of government was critical in explaining why capitalism emerged out of the feudal arrangement in Europe about that time. Government played a critical role in protecting private property. It might seem like a no-brainer for us today to say that somebody who owns a big pile of wealth, a big company, a big factory, yeah, it's theirs, and they can do with it as they want. That idea was not self-evident back in the 1800s, and it certainly wasn't stable in either a legal or a physical sense. So the early days of capitalism had to erect all kinds of legal protections that allowed people to own private land, for example, which used to be held in common, and to accumulate vast stockpiles of wealth and not worry about someone coming along and just taking it. You also had government play a critical role in building a market that was workable for these early businesses, including unifying the market beyond these separate feudal enclaves, where one lord didn't trust the neighboring lord and they didn't really go back and forth. And if they did go back and forth, they might not use the same weights and measures and currency even. And that obviously limited the amount of trade and investment and profit that could be generated. So in England, in France, initially, a strong central state unified these countries, broke down some of those barriers among different feudal lords, and built economies where capitalists who specialized in particular products and sold those products across the whole land could prosper. Other countries where that was slower, think of a place like Germany or Italy, where those feudal enclaves didn't really get together until much later, and they were slower in developing an advanced capitalist system. Colonialism was a very important part of the early days of capitalism. And that also depended on the state. That depended on a strong central state that could equip, conquistadors and other explorers to go around the world and plant the flag and subdue the natives, and then start sucking the wealth out of those colonies, including obviously gold and silver and other precious metals that supported the expansion of the money supply and spending power in these early capitalist economies. They were also captive markets for the products of early capitalists. So the whole population of India, the massive population of India, a captive market for British capitalists to sell their textiles and other early industrial products. They talked about free trade and free markets, but they had this whole thing that was locked up for them, the Indian subcontinent. And then, of course, the most despicable dimension of it was the trade in humans, the slave trade, and the role that played in developing a forced labor market. Even at home, the state was very, very active and interventionist in developing labor supply for these new private businesses, including by kicking people off the land, the so-called enclosures movement, where under the feudal regime, people supported themselves off common land, and the lord came around once a year and collected half your crop. That wasn't a great arrangement, but at least you had the land. Then, along with capitalism, number one, the feudal lords wanted to use these new private property rights to put fences around their land. It's not common anymore, it's theirs, and push these workers off the land into the cities where they'd be desperate enough to work for 12 hours a day, 7 days a week for pennies in the new factories. And that didn't happen by itself. That happened because the state deliberately intervened to create a compliant supply of labor for those businesses. Does that ring any bells? Oops, there's my energy efficient lights going off. Hold on. I'm so politically correct, but it does mean I have to stand up and wave my arms every half an hour. Does that sound familiar? The government today, pressured. You got businesses saying people are coddled. I need people to come and work for a minimum wage for 3 or 4 hours at a shift whenever I call them. And then the government should cut off the income supports and do other things to compel people to accept those jobs. That role of the government in creating and policing a desperate force of workers who will accept those jobs under unfavorable conditions. That is as old as capitalism. And the police initially, just any efforts by workers, as we talked about a couple of weeks ago, any efforts by workers to organize and fight for a better deal, the police would come in and just bust it up and break the unions, imprison the leaders, or worse, kill them in some cases. And even today around the world, labor relations and that kind of thing are very, very tightly regulated and policed by government rules about what unions can and can't do. Again, you can't call it deregulation in any sense at all. So let's fast forward to today. Okay, a couple hundred years after capitalism was formed, government played a critical role in creating and stabilizing and growing capitalism. Let's take a minute right now and think about ways, in your experience, you see government actively promoting the interests of private business, as opposed to jumping in and screwing things up. There are ways the government does that as well. But I'm going to argue that there's a historical continuity, and that instead of government and capitalism being on opposite sides of the spectrum, in fact, they work hand in hand. So let's just take a moment and shout it out in the Q&A. Use the Q&A to put some ideas in, and I'll just read a few out as they come through here. The tax system favors capitalists. Red tape reduction, that's a good one. Every government, certainly every conservative-minded government, comes to power promising a commission to get rid of red tape, which they don't even talk about what red tape is. What is red tape? Red tape, for example, is a set of rules that says restaurants have to make sure the food is clean before they serve it, or cars can't blow up when a car hits them from behind. That's red tape. Terrible. Government sets a minimum wage, usually at a level that's too low. Government allows weaker working conditions and benefits for part-time and gig workers. That's a good one. Scientific research credits. There's a good one. We've got a whole tax system and grants and other ways to fund what capitalists are supposed to do on their own, which is think up good ideas and make them happen. Highway 407, there's a good one, Bob. Built by the public and owned privately, so they collect good profits every time you drive on it. Preferential tax rates, lower taxes for businesses than individuals, quite right. Regulations for a stable banking system. Here's a very good one. Thank you, Richard. That's a great suggestion. We got a whole monetary and banking system where the government regulates it, sets rules, but also stabilizes it, and then jumps in to save their butts every time the system melts down, which it does from time to time. So there's another way. The government is there to help business. Loan guarantees, infrastructure, a great idea, highways and utilities and so on, to make sure that business can function. Partnerships around infrastructure, so that, again, like Highway 407, the public builds it and the private sector profits from it. Loan guarantees, including for small business. Income supports to maintain effective demand. You're quite right. That's another way the government manages the workings of the whole economy so that businesses have a strong market. Oh, this is great. Have a look here yourself, folks, as we go through. We've got a whole catalog. Man, that's excellent. Thank you very much, everyone. Okay, so I'm going to just list a few myself. Page 269 of the book, for those that have it, either hard copy or PDF. I think it's consistent with what we just saw. Protect private property, that's an important one. And by the way, it's a far-reaching and intangible one. Think of all of the forms of private property today, including life forms or pharmaceutical formulas or patents. Those are all ways of protecting private property rights, and the state is really active in policing that. You can get arrested in one part of the world and extradited to the U.S. because you copied software. So that is the long arm of government. That is not the free market. Pay for basic infrastructure, we heard that. Pay for essential training and schooling so that the workers have the adequate supplies, or skills rather, and knowledge to function effectively in modern workplaces. And we're always hearing from business that they want to see closer connection between what's taught in schools and what they need as employers, as if the only reason to go to school is to be a good worker, as opposed to being a well-rounded member of society. Manage and police labor relations, that's still very, very important. Business-friendly macroeconomic environment, we talked about that just now. Enforce stable rules and standards, that was an early role of the state, and it still is in terms of setting standards, even around some new technologies and so on, to make sure that we can speak to each other digitally. Support business investment with incentives, favorable taxes, open up new markets. That includes new markets at home by privatizing things that used to be delivered through public services or other non-commercial channels, or international markets through free trade agreements and so on. Tax loopholes and subsidies for high income earners. That's the one that I put up before we started this in terms of capital gains exemptions and so on. And then rescue businesses in times of crisis. That was my top 10 list, kind of a David Letterman type top 10 list for those that remember David Letterman. But again, in the Q&A, I'm just really impressed with that rich and fast response to the question. Thank you. Okay, let's talk about what role, what impact, what footprint the government has on the economy. The government does a lot of things. It collects taxes from different parts of the economy in different ways, and then it spends money in different ways. Some of what they spend money on is just a straight up redistribution. They take from one and give to another. So an important part of government activity, I'll show you this in a minute, is what are called transfer payments, where governments just pay out money to individuals for different reasons or to businesses for different reasons. So the government hasn't actually directly done anything with the money, it's just kind of redistributed it. They also undertake the direct provision of public services through different channels. So this is another way that the government has an impact on real production. Remember, I've defined the economy as the sum total of the work that we do to produce goods and services. And that includes the stuff that is produced, mostly services, but we used to produce some goods, still do some goods in publicly owned workplaces, mostly at services like healthcare and education. So where the government has that impact as well. The impacts of it all, obviously on people's incomes, they're affected by government. First of all, they're now paying taxes to government. In some cases, they're getting money back from government in transfer payments. And then for those who work in the activity of producing public goods and services, you're getting wages from it. So public sector workers. The impacts on production, even when government isn't directly doing it themselves, they have a big role. The government's impact on actual GDP and output and production includes a direct provision of public goods and services. I've mentioned there on the slide 15% of GDP. It's actually a little bit higher than that now, and I'll show you that in a minute. They also impact on production by buying stuff from business. Government itself is a major customer of the private business sector through what's called procurement, when government goes out and buys stuff from private firms. That's important. And then government can also affect how production and work occurs through its regulations on all kinds of things, including how work has to occur, safety standards, environmental standards, other types of regulation, even the regulation of the banking system, as we just talked about. All of that can affect the conditions of production. So Government has a huge footprint on the economy through all kinds of different channels. And if you've been reading the book, you know that we've developed in the book kind of a map, an ongoing map of the different interactions in the economy. And we haven't gone through that in these lectures for time reasons, but you'll see that we build the map and then we show the different ways that government impacts on these things. So let's have a little look at Canada's government and the economic footprint of Canada's government. I'm using, for these statistics, I'm using 2019, the last year before the pandemic. The pandemic obviously changed things a lot, including a suddenly bigger role for government. But I don't want to be too influenced by what happened in the pandemic because we don't know where it's going to go. But let's look at what the status quo was before the pandemic hit in 2019. So that direct production, as I mentioned, the direct output of goods and services, about $350 billion worth of goods and services produced not by for-profit private businesses, but by public sector agencies that are producing something for a different reason. You know, we've defined capitalism. One of the defining features of capitalism being most output, most work, is motivated by the desire of a private company to produce something and sell it for profit. And that reality, that motivation, affects all kinds of things in how the economy works. But it isn't universal. We have an important share of our economy that is not organized on for-profit grounds. Instead, it is organized on grounds that government is providing a service because the citizens and taxpayers and electors demand it. So that's about 17.5% of GDP, a little higher than the 15% that I mentioned. Now, that direct output is not the full extent of the footprint, of course. There's also a much bigger footprint in terms of total revenues that are collected by the government. By governments, I should say, because of course in Canada we have several levels of government. 40%, just over 40% of GDP shows up one way or another in government revenue. So that's like 40 cents on the dollar, which is significant. It's not the biggest in the world. In fact, it's somewhat small by the standards of other industrial countries, higher than the U.S. In the U.S., it's around 35%, much lower than in places like France and Sweden, where that ratio would be over 50%. $950 billion on a net basis collected by governments at all levels in 2019. Here's the breakdown of it. This is interesting. $350 billion went to the feds. The feds, in a way, have the strongest revenue foothold in the economy because they can apply things countrywide and they're less subject to individuals or business trying to evade their taxes by just shifting what province their head office is in or shifting what province they file a tax return in. Of course, that still happens internationally. Then you've got $500 billion in revenue for the provinces, $200 billion for local governments, and then another part of what's defined as the government sector in Canada is the Canada Pension and Quebec Pension Plan. These are the public pension plans that have a statutory identity that's different from government. They are arm's length institutions, and so they're reported separately. Now, Merle, you being the mathematical / economic genius, you just instantaneously noted that 5 was half of 10. You will note, no doubt, that this total adds up to more than 950 billion. So you're actually up to about 1.1 billion on this total. So what gives, Jim, PhD economist, can't even add? Okay, here's what's happening. There's transfers between different levels of government that go on behind the scenes. So a big chunk of that 350 billion from the feds, 100 billion and more, is paid out to the provinces. So some of that 500 billion that shows up as provincial revenue was collected by the federal government and then transferred to the provinces to help pay for healthcare and education and other programs. Likewise, a big chunk of local government revenue comes from higher levels of government, mostly the provinces, but some federal money shows up in that. So that's where you're getting some double counting happening there, which is why the total is smaller than the sum of the parts. Nevertheless, big impact. Let's talk about employment. That 17.5% of GDP produced in the public sector requires workers to produce it, because just like anywhere else in the economy, it takes work, our brains and brawn, to make that happen and to come up with that $350 billion of GDP. And so there's almost 4 million Canadians who work somewhere in the public sector, which is about 20% of employment. So very important role that the government plays in the labor market. And in fact, the share of total compensation to workers is higher, about almost 1/4 of total compensation. Why? Because public sector jobs, on average, not all of them, but on average, are more full-time and better paid than many private sector jobs. Not all, but better paid than many others for various reasons. Partly the skills that are required for public sector work. Public sector employees, on average, are better educated and better qualified than in the private sector. Partly the public accountability on governments. It's harder for governments to be as exploitive as a company like Amazon or whatever is. So they face public scrutiny of their employment practices, so they have to pay a little better. And also unions. The public sector workforce is about 75% unionized, which means they have a better chance to negotiate better wages and benefits and pensions, whereas the private sector in Canada is about 17% unionized. So a much less common collective bargaining to level the playing field there, as we talked about a couple of weeks ago. Investment. Public investment is very important. And this comes back to, again, what I was saying just in that little catch-up bit of today's discussion, where private investment seems to be slowing down because private capitalists have lost their work ethic. They've become too accustomed to coupons clipping and dividends and easy capital gains, and they've lost the will to invest. Public investment, even before COVID, made up 26% of all non-residential capital spending in Canada. And so this is all kinds of things. This is roads and bridges, obviously. We see a lot of that these days if you're trying to drive around the city at all. But all kinds of other things as well, including healthcare facilities and schools and libraries and cultural facilities and utilities and so on. So very important on the investment side. And part of what I'm going to argue as we go through this course is we got to expand the role of public investment so that we get more investment and better investment than we get from the private sector, because investment is critical at driving economic growth. We hear a lot about government debt. Governments in Canada have about $1.9 trillion in gross debt. That is, Canada's GDP is $2.2 trillion. So we're getting close to 100% of GDP being reflected in gross government debt. Now, I say gross debt. That means this is the amount that governments owe to all kinds of creditors, not just bondholders and banks and investors, but even, for example, pension funds. Governments owe money to their future pensioners, and the unfunded liabilities in government pension funds, which sometimes are significant, sometimes they're not, are a form of government debt. But then from that, you have to deduct the value of government assets. So, just like, somebody who has a mortgage, the mortgage is a debt, but you do have to compare it to the value of the house that you bought with the mortgage and compare what the net situation is. So on a net basis, after considering government financial assets, the net debt is 1.35 trillion, or about 58% of GDP. Interesting to note, we hear a lot about government debt. We hear a little less about household debt, and we hear almost nothing about corporate debt. But both households and corporations are more indebted than governments, measured as a share of GDP. And the focus on government debt is very disproportionate and motivated by an ideological mission to try and downsize government programs and cut back what government does. The reality is governments are less in debt than households and businesses, and governments have much better capacity to carry debt than households and businesses do. The most secure asset you can buy is a federal government bond, because everyone knows the federal government is not going to go broke. So that's why interest rates on federal debt are much lower than what households pay on mortgages and credit cards and what companies pay on their bonds. And it's interesting that we recognize that households have logical reasons to go into debt, to buy a house, to buy a car, to put their kid through university. Companies have a logical reason to go in debt, finance an asset and an investment. Yet that logic never seems to apply to governments, who also have logical reasons to go into debt, particularly when they're paying for those fixed investments and other programs. Here's a breakdown of the revenues. How do we get the revenues in the government sector? That 950 billion that was collected in 2019. The biggest single source is personal income taxes. Almost a third comes through that. And this is, I think, a positive thing because personal income taxes in Canada are collected on a progressive basis, which means you pay a higher rate of tax when you make more money. And that most people, not all, most people think that's an ethical and fair way to do things. And countries which rely more on personal income taxes tend to have a better progressive distribution of after-tax income. Corporate taxes make up about 1/10 of all total revenue. Sales taxes, the GST and PST in places that don't have the harmonized sales tax, about 20%. Payroll taxes. This is where you pay tax on the basis of a deduction from your income when you're an employee. And these mostly consist of contributions to different social programs, like the CPP that we just talked about, or workers' compensation, or the employment insurance premiums that are deducted from your paycheck. So about 1/10. And then the other 30%, a whole range of different taxes and levies collected via different measures. Land taxes, for example, are important in school boards and local government. A little bit now on carbon taxes and environmental taxes make up some of that. So an interesting, quite diversified revenue base for governments. We can talk about the fairness of taxes. Income taxes, as I mentioned, are progressive because the rate rises with income. Sales taxes, in theory, are favored by more sort of market and business-oriented economists as a way of encouraging savings. Mostly it's because business-oriented economists don't like income taxes because business and the people who own them pay higher rates. So they would prefer to shift to a sales tax where everyone pays the same rate. And in fact, recognizing that rich people save a lot more of their income for obvious reasons, they actually end up paying a lower rate of overall tax than poor people do. So in that way, sales taxes are a bit unfair, although they're still an important source of government revenue. Corporations pay taxes on their net profits or sometimes on their capital. This is an old-fashioned way of taxing companies, and we still do it a little bit, not very much, where we tax companies on the basis of how much is invested in them. I don't like them because that's a way of discouraging investment, and we want more investment, not less. Payroll taxes, as I mentioned. Wealth taxes would be a fair way to go at the fact that 2% of the population own the controlling interest in business wealth, 50% or so of business wealth. That would be a way to do it fairly. The one major wealth tax we have in Canada are the land taxes that are paid at the municipal level, including for school boards. And there's experiments, for example, here in BC, where I am, to make the tax progressive so that you would pay a higher rate of land tax if you have a $5 million mansion than if you have a $500,000 condo. What am I talking about? $500,000 condo? What planet do I live on? There's none of those, not in Vancouver. And environmental taxes, such as a carbon tax or other taxes on pollution, of course, are a new one. Let's talk about how governments spend the money. Here's the $930 billion that governments spent. Now, the eagle-eyed among you will note we collected $950, we spent $930. So we spent less than we collected, which means the government sector as a whole had a surplus in 2019, which goes against the grain of the kind of debt and deficit hyperbole that we often hear. The federal government had a small deficit in 2019. Most provinces had deficits. The Canada Pension Plan had a big surplus because it takes in more money than it pays out these days. And also, there's a question about how you measure the deficit and debt. There's different ways of doing it on a public accounts basis or a national accounts basis. The bottom line, governments actually took in a little more money than they spent in 2019. And here's what they spent it on: 30% on the 20% of the workforce that works in the public sector, 21% on procurement from private businesses. So that's a heck of a lot of money there. That's pretty well $200 billion that governments are spending buying stuff from the private sector. The private sector likes that, doesn't it? They're not complaining about that. Social benefits and transfer payments, a quarter, a little bit of interest on the debt. The share of money spent on interest on the debt has declined a lot in recent years, and 17% on a whole range of other programs. So it's as we talked about at the beginning, we want to think not just about is government big or small, but whose interests are governments serving. And there are obviously ways that workers have benefit from the size and scope and interventions of government. They get an extra source of consumption. Two things at play there. One is the public services themselves. That is a form of consumption. We sometimes call that the social wage, the fact that our standard of living is higher because we get healthcare and education and other things that are produced in the public sector that we don't pay for out of our wallet. We pay for collectively through how we finance government. I mean, you do pay some out of your wallet if there's user fees and so on, but most public services you just get, and that increases your standard of living. You also have access to those transfer payments, so welfare payments, child tax benefit, pension payments, disability benefits, EI, etc. So an extra source of income and the ability to finance your standard of living. The working class in general has this new employer making up 20% of all jobs, the public sector, and the ability to use their leverage to improve the standards in those jobs more than they've been able to in the private sector. And that helps the working class. It gives them an extra source of more stable and higher quality work and a base from which they can try and argue to lift the standards in the private sector. And then because we fought for and won democracy, an imperfect democracy, I would argue, but still democracy, it wasn't democratic at the beginning. Capitalism, Milton Friedman often argues that capitalism and democracy are almost synonyms. That's nonsense. Well, he doesn't argue that anymore because he's dead, but he did argue that. And that's nonsense. Capitalism was a dictatorship in the early days, a dictatorship of property owners. You had to have property in order to vote. And it was only through decades and decades of struggles that workers won the right to vote eventually. And frankly, women didn't get it till this century. And indigenous people didn't get it till the 1960s. So there's nothing inherently democratic about this economic system. We had to fight for it. And when we got it, we got the potential to push the government to do more things for us, more things for the masses of people. On the other hand, I've been arguing the state and capitalism go hand in hand, and that's still the case. Capitalists have a lot of benefit from the fact that government is here. Spending power, that 20% of government spending, buying stuff from private business, power to police and regulate and stabilize the whole system in the different ways that we've talked about, and then a bailout whenever things turn ugly. So all of this talk about, stand on your own 2 feet, dog eat dog, survival of the fittest goes out the window whenever the excrement hits the air conditioning device. Okay, that's my non-offensive way of saying something else. Whenever things go south, the government steps in with its power and its money. And we saw that in the global financial crisis in 2008, the Stephen Harper government, the most pro-business government we've had probably in the post-war era. Boom, $200 billion like that to stabilize the private banks. And of course, during COVID, we saw government mobilize much larger sums to stabilize the economy. So this is not capitalism versus the government. This is still capitalism working together with the government. But workers, thanks to democracy and thanks to our greater numbers, where our working class is 85% of the population, remember, and there's another 13% that's small business people, are farmers, and 2% who own the majority of business wealth. Those numbers work in our favor whenever there's a genuine democratic decision. So let's talk about how neoliberalism has responded to the role of government during the kind of post-war era, the 50s, 60s, and 70s. There I go with my oldies, goldies DJ voice again. The greatest economic policies of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Government grew and expanded, and taxes grew, and income support payments grew, and public service production grew. Since then, since the end of the 70s, when neoliberalism began, there has been an emphasis on downsizing government and mostly refocusing government. Government is still strong. Even in the United States, government accounts for 35% of GDP. So it's not like government disappeared. Government is there. It has huge resources. The question is, what are they using the resources for and in whose interests? And this idea that government is powerless, or that neoliberalism has been about getting government out of the way, nonsense. Government is not out of the way anywhere. The question is that government policy has been refocused to put more emphasis on the list of things that you guys threw out so effectively, things that help business directly, and less government emphasis on things that might support the rest of us, but in a way that business doesn't like, such as direct provision of public services rather than privatizing it and letting private businesses do it, or policies that strengthen the bargaining position of working people in their own dealings with private employers, like the big income supports that were put in place during COVID. A little bit in our last few minutes here, our last roughly 5 minutes, about debts and deficits and the kind of arguments that are out there. A deficit is defined as when the government spends more than it takes in. And that's also true for households and also true for businesses. Households and businesses have deficits whenever they undertake loans to do more spending than they had revenue. And by the way, households are constantly in deficit. Households collectively always spend more than they take in. And the difference is made up by household borrowing. And it's a good thing that happens, because if that wasn't possible, if households had to live within their means, as is often portrayed, ma and pa sitting at the kitchen table, making sure we're paying for everything we buy, the economy would be in perpetual depression, because you'd never have anybody borrowing to buy a house or a car or anything else. So households are always in deficit, corporations are almost always in deficit, and governments are often in deficit as well. You can have a cyclical deficit, which is caused by just the economy going through a bad period. When that happens, taxes automatically fall because less people are working and paying taxes. There's less spending, less sales taxes, etc. But spending tends to grow because you're paying out EI benefits and other supports. That's a cyclical deficit that gets bad in bad times and gets better in good times. On the other hand, you can also have a structural deficit, it's called, where on an ongoing basis, even when the economy is in good shape, you're not bringing in enough revenue to pay for it. The debt is simply adding all of the deficits together. So 1 year's deficit creates a little debt. If you're in a deficit the next year, then the debt gets bigger, and so on and so forth. Public debt, as I mentioned, is not unusual, and debt is not unusual. We have households and corporations that are in debt. So you don't have to sweat about paying off debt. And any politician who said my top priority is going to be to go to pay off debt is just trying to pull something over your eyes. If a corporate CEO said that, any corporate CEO who stood up and said, my top priority is running this company is to pay off its debt, they'd be thrown out on their ear at the next shareholders meeting, because any investor would realize that's an idiotic thing to say. If you can take on debt and invest it and grow profits, that's a good thing to do. We're not going to put some superstitious nimnam in the CEO's chair. We want someone who knows what they're doing. And the same argument is true. As long as the debt is used to make the economy stronger and more productive, including financing public investment, as long as the debt is roughly stable as a share of GDP, and more importantly, the interest costs are stable as a share of GDP, then it's quite fine. And most of the big phobia and hysteria that we've heard about debt in recent years has been aimed at trying to create the political conditions in which working people will vote for a government that cuts things that benefit working people. That's a neat trick. And the only way it'll happen is because working people get kind of hoodwinked into thinking that this is a big problem. And it's absolutely fine for governments to run moderate deficits every year. You never have to balance the budget, and bigger deficits when times are weak. And you still have to collect taxes, including on individuals in particular, but also to some extent on businesses to pay for stuff. This is a picture of the amount of money that governments pay in interest on debt as a share of GDP over the last 30 years. And it's declined a lot since the mid-90s for a couple of reasons. Number one, the debt as a share of GDP has declined, at least until COVID. More importantly, interest rates have fallen dramatically. And by the way, we control interest rates. The Bank of Canada sets the leading interest rate. So we have the power to take that into our own hands. And even under COVID, this ratio actually fell, because COVID debt grew a lot, but the interest rates fell even further. So the net impact was negative.